Okay, so hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending when you are sitting, listening, and watching this webinar. I hope you are doing well and staying safe. On behalf of the SP University of Boumerdès Student Chapter, I would like to welcome you all for our today's webinar about using scenario planning for decision-making in the energy industry. I am Abdelkader, Master's Petroleum Engineering student at the University of Boumerdès in Algeria, and I will be your moderator for today. Before starting, please, I would like to remind you to drop your questions in the Q&A section below. Our guest will be answering them at the end of the session. And please keep your mics muted and the chat box as professional as you can. Now, without further ado, let us give a warm welcome to Mr. Henk Krijnen. Our guest has completed a career of 35 years with Shell, which took him to Indonesia, Thailand, the United States, and Netherlands. During his last 5 years in Shell's corporate strategy department, he played a pivotal role in establishing new approaches for risk and scenario analysis within the company. In 2015, he founded Navincerta to develop online training and integrated this into joint venture Claridec in 2020. Our guest was also an SP 2020-2021 distinguished lecturer. Thank you so much again for joining us. Thank you, sir, for coming. And the mic is now totally yours.
Thank you very much, Abdelkader. So I'm very pleased to be with you and to share my knowledge and some of my experiences with you on the topic of scenario planning. So this is indeed a distinguished lecture presentation that I've delivered a number of times over the past year, always by Zoom for reasons that you are aware of. The SPE Foundation does this through member donations and the contributions from offshore Europe, and it's also grateful to the companies that allow the professionals to serve as lecturers, and support is provided by AIME. So the title is Using Scenario Planning for Decision-Making in the Energy Industry. And clearly, scenario planning is something that people talk about particularly often in the last few years with a situation with so much uncertainty. I also had to think about this when I heard about the bad fires in your country, and I hope they are now reducing and that the situation is improving. So about myself, so I spent 35 years in, well, Abdelkader already mentioned this really, 35 years in Shell, seismic in Indonesia, Thai Shell, in the United States in the last 5 years, in strategy and planning in The Hague, where I learned about the scenario planning as a tool to better understand the business environment, and in particularly, obviously, the energy business environment. So the agenda for today is as follows. I will talk a little bit about forecasts and scenarios. Then we'll take a look at very old scenarios, and I will explain why. And then clearly we must focus on, we must take a look at scenarios focused on energy. Talk about how scenarios relate to decision-making. How do you use that in decision-making? And then I'll take a look at an oil asset example. And a few years ago, in 2017, I was, as a consultant, after my Shell time, involved in developing some scenarios about Algeria. So I thought it would be interesting to take the work from that exercise to this presentation, and we can have a chat, a bit of a discussion about that. And then we'll finish off with some conclusions. And although, let's say your general questions and maybe the more broader discussion are best done at the end of the presentation, if there's anything you don't understand, I can clarify things at the points between these presentation parts. I can pause for a moment and check if there's any questions that need clarifying. So about scenarios and forecasts. Yeah, so you are still, most of you, I guess, are still in education at the university. But if you're a reservoir engineer or a petroleum engineer or any type of other engineer or professional in an oil and gas company, yeah, you will be exposed to the need to make forecasts of reservoirs, of production, of business plans, and so on, oil prices, gas prices. You will have to have forecasts. So they are the most likely outlook for something, for example, an oil price or a production profile. And you need that in order to manage your business. You need to do that in order to make budgets and things like that. But you will also understand that such a forecast is always wrong. There's almost always a lot of uncertainty when making those forecasts, when making predictions. You have to have a best guess, but you also have to recognize that there is uncertainty around that. And one way to deal with that uncertainty is to present multiple possible scenarios for those outlooks. And what we mean by scenario, I mean, the word scenario is used a lot in different ways, but what I mean with scenario in the context of this presentation is an outlook to a different business environment, a different future world. What does the world look like, for example, in 2040? You know, how will people manage their business? How will countries cooperate with each other? What will the state of the economy be? What will be the geopolitical situation? All those things would be part of that scenario thinking. And if you look at that at the country level, you would be looking at, for example, questions like, you know, how will the country be doing in so many years from now? What will be the issues in play? What will the population be like? What will our economy be like? What type of industry will have evolved, and that sort of thing. So this is what I mean by scenario. So not, let's say, a single oil price outlook or a single production forecast, but a broader description of what the world will look like. So they are plausible narratives, and these narratives, these storylines should span more or less the uncertainty range, because you do not know what the future holds, so you will have to have multiple stories to explain where the world can go, where your country can go, where your region can go. And usually the number of scenarios is, well, 2, 3, or 4, basically. You don't want, you know, you could imagine you can make 10 or 20 scenarios, but that is not really very useful. So they're not forecasts, they cannot be precise, they're not static. They can change over time, you get new insights, and you may need to adjust them as you go along. When you develop scenarios, you need to think about, okay, what is the geographic area that you're dealing with? And now for energy is very much a global issue. You can imagine oil prices are global. There's a lot of trade across the globe. So the energy industry is typically a global industry, although there are clearly also regional and local topics to be dealt with. But generally, it's a global thing. So you would tend to think that you need to take the world at large as your geographic area. Then you need to define what are the themes you want to cover. So obviously, if you relate again to energy, you need to think about economics, technology, geopolitics, environmental issues, that sort of things. And the time horizon. Are you looking at 5 years from now, or do you want to take a long-term view and maybe even up to the rest of the century, for example? The purpose of scenario planning can be different. Well, first and foremost, obviously, companies develop scenarios to help them in their strategy work, to make decisions, to decide, you know, whether to invest in a particular technology or not, whether to develop a certain business more deeply or not. But scenarios can also be used, and some companies do that, like Shell and BP and Equinor, for public debate as a contribution to the discussion about the energy system, and as a way to engage with the politicians, to engage with the public. And scenarios can also be used for bridging gaps. So if you a scenario, for example, just to give an example, I was involved in a scenario exercise around an environmentally sensitive area in the North Sea with environmental groups, so NGOs, and I was representing, let's say, the industry, and with authorities, with politicians, people from the administration. And by collectively developing scenarios, you sort of explore what all the issues are in a very very comfortable way, and you don't immediately jump to particular conclusions. It's a way to bridge gaps, to understand each other better, and that's also can be a purpose of scenario planning. Some scenarios are sometimes called memories of the future. So think about that for a moment. So it means that if you have done a scenario exercise, you've actually thought about the future. And that means that if something happens, you can maybe more quickly relate to what has happened because you have already thought about it. And it means that you can be quicker in your thinking about what actions to take. For example, let's take the recent situation in Afghanistan. If countries would have paid more attention to what would be the scenarios for that situation to evolve, let's say 2 or 3 months ago, they would not be taken by surprise as to what has happened now. And the same applies to the COVID situation. Governments often wait until something happens and then they react, and then they're too late. So by developing scenarios, you think in advance about what might happen, and you can act more quickly and more decisively. So the essence of scenario planning, what is it really? Well, you have a number of uncertainties, a number of things you don't know. For example, how fast will the Taliban progress? Will there be new variants with the COVID virus, for example? So there are many uncertainties. You don't know what will happen. So you look at each uncertainty and you say, well, there are multiple different outcomes. And then a scenario is an approach to string together those multiple different outcomes into one coherent story. And that if this happens, then that is likely to be associated with something else that happens, and so on. So you link these things together. So you don't have 10 or 20 scenarios, but you can sort of boil it down to, say, 3 or 4 scenarios that each tell a coherent story of what can happen. Scenarios need to be challenging but plausible. So the whole idea of scenario planning is that you don't get trapped into a tunnel vision, like the bottom right. You want it to be plausible. On the other hand, you don't want to be what you could call cycling in the air, having fantasies, having wild, interesting stories that are not really realistic. So you need to be in between those. You want to get away from the tunnel vision, but you don't want to get into unproductive fantasies either. So let me pause there. Abdelkader, any questions from anybody at this time?
I will check. So actually, we don't have any questions. So
okay,
if anyone has a question, please drop it in the chat.
Yeah, just don't hesitate to ask. But at the end of this presentation, we can get into discussion if you like. Yeah. So let's go back to an old set of scenarios of 1992. And why do I choose that? Well, that's because they're very remarkable scenarios, if you think about it. In 1992, in Shell, they came up with two scenarios. And yeah, I must say this is a little bit from a European American perspective, but I hope you can sort of relate to this because a number of the issues that play a role actually happened in Europe and America. But in 1992, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was an atmosphere of, we need to liberalize, we need to globalize. There's the internet. There are going to be plenty of opportunities for new economic development and things like that. And that was then seen as one outlook for the world, that globalization and liberalization would go around the entire world. But on the other hand, they had the scenario that says, well, that may happen initially, but then there might be a reaction to that. This globalization may be a threat to entrenched interests, and there may be losers. There will be issues with religious and cultural identities, and it may lead to an atmosphere of resistance. So there are two scenarios. One was called New Frontiers, and the other was called Barricades. So New Frontiers was the scenario where globalization would succeed, dramatic growth in core countries, cooperative approach to global problems, drive towards democracy, all that stuff, good stuff. But there was also another scenario that is saying, well, there would be resistance against liberalization, globalization. There will be more nationalism, there will be more protectionism. Countries will have their own brand of capitalism. There is going to be a fragmented political spectrum. Populist parties will come up, and there may be issues with physical barriers against migration. Well, and I guess you have, in the past few years, been following the news and know that at least in Europe and the United States, all these issues on the right-hand side of this slide have popped up. There has been increased nationalism and protectionism. There has been a fragmented political spectrum. For example, in my country at the moment, there are 18 political parties. It is unworkable. And physical barriers against migration. Think about the wall that Mr. Trump wanted to build at the border with Mexico. So in 1992, they have thought about this already, all these things that might happen. And they didn't say it's going to be this way or it's going to be that way, but the future will hold elements of both scenarios. Well, this is, let me skip this slide because this is really about European politics and that may not be that relevant here. So why is that of interest for energy? These issues around how the globalization will work, the political tensions and stuff like that. Well, it's because geopolitics and global governments will have an impact on global economic growth. So protectionism, for example, will lead to lower economic growth, and that will lead to lower energy demand. Society issues, societal preferences will impact national political developments, and that will obviously lead to regulation. And then clearly, in the last 1 or 2 decades, the topic of climate change has popped up as a very important issue. And technology developments are clearly important as well. Think about, for example, the fracking technology that has led to the shale oil production in the United States that has had so much impact on the oil price. But also the shallow gas developments obviously have been very important for the gas price in the North America. So all these things, they lead to implications for the energy mix. Right? Clearly, climate change obviously has a lot of impact on how we deal with fossil fuels in the future. So by understanding all these things, you can develop scenarios that are relevant for you as an energy company. So let's talk a little bit about scenarios focusing on energy, and let me just check if there are any questions so far about this.
No, sir. Still no
Not
questions.
yet? No worries. We can.
Yeah.
So let's look a little bit at scenarios focusing on energy. So there are a number of oil and gas companies that do scenario planning. That's part of their strategy development, and they also publish the scenario work that they do. And examples are clearly Shell, where I worked, but also Equinor, BP, and maybe some others. But those I think are the most well-known companies that actually do work in the terms of scenarios and publish that on the internet, and you can easily find it on their websites if you would like. So the Shell 2021 scenarios, they came out in February, they have 3 scenarios: waves, islands, and sky. And waves is a scenario where there is a lot of economic growth, reasonably liberal, globalized world, but with responsible governments. Islands is a scenario where there is more nationalism and protectionism, where there's not a lot of collaboration, and which is going to be not very good for the global warming issue. And sky is a scenario that explains what needs to happen to curtail the emissions to the level of zero, net zero by, I believe, 2070. So this is a backcasting scenario. Equinor also develops scenarios and publishes them, and they typically have 3, 2 that are a little bit similar to Shell. Reform is similar to waves, and rivalry is similar to islands. Rivalry, again, the national focus, geopolitical issues, a bit of fighting between nations, and so on. So focus on energy security, for example, is then important, and patchy climate policies. And then renewal is similar to sky, where it says, okay, what do we need to do to sort of stay within, in this case, 2 degrees global warming. So these scenarios are stories, they're narratives, storylines, but there is also quantitative underpinning. So there are a lot of quantitative modeling that is being done in conjunction with the thinking about the scenarios, the thinking about the future. And this is an example of such a quantitative exercise that has been done in Equinor, that then shows what is going to be the oil demand based on different scenarios. So, for example, in the rivalry, the scenario where there is a very national focus in many countries, the idea is that the oil demand will not decline. But in the case of where we really take climate change seriously, the oil price will decline quite a bit. And obviously that also means that the oil demand will decline quite a bit, and obviously that means that the oil price will also go down quite a bit. The World Energy Council is a collaboration between 30+ countries based in London. They also publish scenarios. You can also look that up. A little bit similar. They usually give these scenarios catchy names like modern jazz, unfinished symphony, hard rock. For example, again, hard rock is a fragmented world with inward-looking policies, lower growth, and less global cooperation. You can already see the patterns in these scenarios, they're coming back all the time. And yeah, you can also recognize those tendencies in what is happening in the real world into a lesser or greater degree. The International Energy Agency in Paris also has a set of scenarios. I will not go through them one by one, but just outline that what they do is really look at what the implications are of policy measures on the energy system. That's really their focus. So they, for example, keep the economic growth at the same level across all scenarios. So this is a crude categorization. So on the left, you see the organization, Shell, Equinor, World Energy, and BP, for example. And you can categorize these scenarios a little bit, and they're always a little bit different, of course, but with a national orientation, market and technology drive, and the green scenarios, what needs to happen to really get to grips with the climate change topic. Okay, any further questions so far? Is it clear?
I guess that it is clear for everyone since we don't have questions until now.
All right. But by all means, folks, do think about questions, do think about topics to discuss, because that would be great at the end of the presentation. So you might say, okay, it's all nice to do all these scenarios, but how do you incorporate that thinking in the decision process? When you make corporate decisions, where do you want to go with your company? What do you need to do? How do you take the insights from those scenarios into account? Well, first of all, we need to distinguish between what I call exploratory scenarios and focus scenarios. The exploratory scenarios are the ones that we just discussed, the 92 scenarios of Shell, the Equinor scenarios, and so on, the International Energy Agency scenarios. They're all exploratory. They are global. They sort of foster divergent thinking. And the whole idea is to get a deep understanding of the business environment, just by describing, by thinking about the future, which way can it go, and really get an understanding of how the business will evolve, how the world will evolve, how a country will evolve. And then you can have focus scenarios that zoom in on a particular issue, a particular investment opportunity, for example. Will I go and do seismic here? Will I invest in this oil field? Do I adopt solar energy as a future for my company? All these questions are more the focus questions, and then you can zoom in on that particular question and work your way backwards and think, what are all the issues that are relevant to answer that question? And then obviously these issues that you come up with will be uncertain, they are uncertainties, and then you will say, okay, then I need to look at different possible outcomes of these uncertainties and see what they mean for my business decision. So those are the focus scenarios. So I distinguish between exploratory scenarios and focus scenarios. Exploratory are more to explore, to understand, and focused is really zooming in on a particular decision. But there are three ways in which scenarios will help decision making. First is the gentle art of reperceiving. And that means that by doing these exploratory scenarios, you understand the business better. You can see the risks, you can see what might happen, and that helps decision makers, if they internalize that, in maybe getting a better grip on the business and making better decisions. And I will show you in a moment a little more detail of that. The other approach is wind tunneling, and you can say, well, I have a few scenarios and I have a few strategy options, and then I have a very structured discussion about and maybe some computations and some calculations as well about how each strategy will work under each scenario. And this is what we did in Shell, for example, when I was still there in 2014 or something like that, where we said we have two scenarios and we have two options. Shell becomes a broad energy company, or Shell stays a oil and gas company. And what are the implications under each scenario, and how does that work out? So we had that discussion, and in the end, I think Shell decided to become a broad energy company. And the last one is then that and this is using these focus scenarios, that you look at the impact on typical decision metrics, like the net present value or the project attractiveness, depending on the scenario. Now let me introduce another speaker. This is Pierre Rock. He already passed away, I believe, in the late 90s, 97. He was the, let's say, founding father of the scenario planning in Shell. And that was actually the first time that scenario planning was introduced for business. So Pierre Rock really is the inventor of the scenario planning approach. And there is still a video of a presentation by him, and he explains in this presentation, let me make sure that I read it, that I run it now. And he explains why scenario planning, how that works with decision makers. Just, I hope the sound is okay, and just listen to Pierre Rock for just a few minutes.
Usually, future-oriented studies have a very low effectiveness. Why is it? What makes the difference between an effective study and a less effective study? It has to do with basic psychology of decision making. You and your neighbor, you have a mental model of the world in which you have to act. This mental model is based on your past experience and on the information you have internalized.
No.
You have digested. And when you have a decision to take, you confront different alternatives of behaving with this mental model. And when a man takes good decision, people say of such a man, he has a good judgment. In fact, he has largely a mental model which is a good match of the real world. We call this internalized model microcosm, as opposed to the real world macrocosm. I would like to suggest that unless you change the mental model of a decision maker, nothing is going to change. He may look interested, but his behavior will not be affected. The point I want to make is the following. The purpose of planning is not to produce a document. What will the world of energy look like in 10 years' time? The purpose of planners is to change the mental map of their critical decision maker. Unless this happens, nothing will follow. It will be like water on a stone. The difference between a decisive company and a company which is less so is largely that in the first case, the worldview, the mindset is clear, or it is fuzzy. This realization from wanting to produce a document which you will not be ashamed of later, with a new target, which was to change the image of reality in the head of the critical decision maker. This is a fundamental switch. It is a revolution in planning, which is as important as when a company switches from selling to marketing.
Okay, so that was Pierre Rock. So he explained again what I just said, and that by doing scenario planning, by thinking about the future in this way, you change the mental model of decision makers. You make them adapt to the new situation, for example, and that will lead to better decision making. But there are also these other ways that you can use to allow scenario planning to influence your decision-making process. Okay, is there a question, Abdelkader?
Okay, so we have one question here. So Amin is asking, in one of, sorry, just a second. In one of the scenarios, it predicted the global demand for oil will decrease. Along with that, oil prices will also decrease. Is it possible for the OPEC countries to decide to lower their oil production in order to keep the prices at the profitable level?
Yes, of course, they can do that. And actually, obviously, apart from let's say supply, so for example, the shale oil production situation has impacted the supply in the world a couple of years ago, and demand. So that's economic growth, and to what extent oil is going to be used as a fuel. It's also the OPEC behavior, and the OPEC discipline that that influences the oil price. So those are the three key items that influence the oil price. So yes, OPEC can do that as long as there is still a reasonable demand for oil. But in one of the scenarios, that demand will drop, and then it will be more difficult for OPEC to influence the price of oil.
Thank you, sir. We have another question, but I think that this one is a general question, so we can keep it to the end.
The AI question, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
All right, okay, let me now zoom in on the Algeria situation, because as I said, I was about a little over 4 years ago, I was working as a consultant for a company to develop some scenarios related to the Algerian situation. So although I'm certainly not an expert at it, I read about it, I know a little bit about it. And we said, okay, and now for that purpose, I introduced the concept of the influence diagram as a way to map out all the topics that are important, all the issues that are important for your project, for your investment opportunity, for your activities. And this is just a simplified version of that. But so you have your project value, and suppose it's an oil investment project, then clearly it will be influenced by oil price, but also by the production profile, cost of schedule, and the taxation. And then you'll have to ask, okay, these different situations, how will they, these different drivers, how will they be influenced by other factors? So, for example, the environmental regulation will impact cost and schedule, but also the security situation. Petroleum policies will influence the tax, but it will also the license extensions, and whether your production profile will be longer than a certain period, and so on. So all these things end up in the end in the project value, but you map your way backwards and try to uncover what are all the key issues that play a role, and that directly or more indirectly in your project. And that's a way to sort of get to understand what all the factors that you need to include in your scenario exercise. But we already have, obviously, these global exploratory scenarios that I explained earlier. Yeah, the ones from Shell or Equinor or whatever, or you can take the ones from the World Energy Council, whatever you would like. You can use those scenarios to get your understanding of the global oil and gas situation. For example, the oil and gas price lines, the cost escalation, carbon costs, exchange rates, all that stuff. You can sort of infer, although it doesn't work, from, they depend on the global scenario that you're looking at. And then you have the country or local external uncertainties, like the permitting or the national legislation. And then you can make that into asset-focused scenarios. So scenarios that describe the business environment for your particular asset or your particular project that you want to make a decision on. But you can also do it slightly differently. You can say, well, this is all the same, but I also want some explicit country scenarios that describe the future. So one layer in between, one step in between the future of a particular country, how it will evolve in the future. And if I am there with my business, what are the implications for me? Now, so I take this example, country scenarios for Algeria, let's say articulated in 2017. So it's a few years ago. I don't know what has happened in between. And you may be able to comment on that, I don't know. But I just go through the step that you need to do to come up with such scenarios. So first, paint a picture, identify the issues that are there, that you can identify. So challenges for business in Algeria. Presence of state industries and insufficient trained personnel, sometimes urbanization issues, vast territories, issues with neighboring countries, exposure to climate change, exposure to oil price. The strengths are strong state, relative stability, maturity of oil and gas industry, the potential for new renewable energy, experienced technocrats in key positions, and enhanced security. Those were the assessments that you could sort of figure out in 2017. So what then you say, well, let's look at what are really the key driving forces that really shape the future of the business environment for a company in Algeria. The oil price is state income, because the state, Algerian state, obviously has a lot of revenues from the oil and gas, and if the oil price goes down, it will affect the way they can manage the country. Government policies and efficiency, clear. Regional geopolitical developments and opportunities. For example, how will the relationship with the European Union evolve? Will there be a good collaboration possible, for example, for renewable energy in the future? Things like that. Impact of climate change and environmental issues. Obviously, you've had major problems last week in Algeria, and desertification is going to be a problem for Algeria, that's clear. And domestic, social, and security issues. So then the step is brainstorm different outcomes and combine in a set of logical scenarios. So if you do that, and this is just very quick and very brief, you could say one scenario is you have a high oil price that might lead to limited reforms, focus on oil and gas, limited renewables, social stability, and there will be a need for environmental adaptation, but there will be some money for that because of the income from the oil and gas revenues. But if you have a low oil price, then obviously that money will be less available and there will be budget issues. But there may be successful reforms. There may be some opportunities for diversification of the energy industry. Some potential social unrest will be mitigated in that way. And in the same way, there will be room for environmental adaptation. And a third scenario is a low oil price with limited reforms, a slow transition to renewables, maybe social unrest, and environmental issues will be difficult to address. So, so from that reasoning that and this is just very quick, and there's a lot more detail clearly, you come up with 3 different scenarios for Algeria, how it may evolve in the future. I don't know if they are plausible, if they are real, or if there are issues that are left out of it. Maybe you can comment on that, that would be good. But this is then some scenarios for the country that you can come up with. And then you will want to think, okay, what are the implications? So if I have a business, if I want to do some investments, then for each scenario, you'll have to imagine, what is the licensing, permitting facilities and infrastructure. What are the issues there? What are the investment regulations under different scenarios? You can imagine in the high oil price scenarios, they will be pretty much the same, but maybe in the low oil price scenarios, there may be some relief. There may be some creative changes in the regulations. National carbon policies, taxes, environmental regulations, joint venture issues, stuff like that. And then obviously that will have an impact on cost, schedule, volume, tax, and price that drive the cost benefit analysis of your assets, of your business, of your projects. And then you can quantify where possible, consider possible outcomes. Think about how do these things logically hang together. And on this basis, what will the investment look like under the 3 different scenarios? And then you really understand where you're looking at and how your investment might work in the country within the local environment. So this is trying to take it from the global level with these exploratory scenarios to a very focused scenario in a particular country. And I just, by accident, am able to take Algeria as an example, and look at the specific situation in that particular local environment. So let me now arrive at conclusions, and then we can maybe have some discussion, or I can answer some more questions. So scenario planning is a way to get to grips with contextual uncertainties in the business environment, and they're not the same as forecasts. The essence is that the important thing is to understand, to examine how things hang together. What are the relationships between all these forces, all these uncertainties, and how should I understand that? And so the focus should be on the underlying driving forces and not only possible outcomes, let's say $70 oil or $90 oil or $50 oil. That's not so important. It's really understanding the underlying driving forces, like the question about what will OPEC still be able to do in a world where there is less oil demand. And I mentioned the 5 driving forces that I thought might be relevant for the Algerian situation. And you will want to distinguish between these global exploratory scenarios for a generic understanding and the focus scenarios that zoom in on a particular investment opportunity or a particular strategy or a particular country situation, and in order to support your decision making. And in that way, if you do that, you can really, they will live up to the characterization of being memories of the future. So that was the end of my presentation. So thank you for listening, but let's see if there are any further questions or things you can teach me.
Okay, so thank you, Mr. Krijnen, for this informative and rich presentation. I really enjoyed and learned a lot. I hope that the attendees too. So we'll pass now to the Q&A session. We'll start by this first question from Halim. Halim is asking, in the future of oil and gas, how do AI will help us in the decision making on predicting better scenarios?
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with AI, and I just only know about it, you know, from what I read in the newspapers and so on. But yeah, if I restrict it to the scenario planning part, then I can imagine that with scenario planning, you need to digest a lot of information in order to, because the first thing you have to do is to really understand what has happened in the past in order to not say, well, I project that into the future, but at least to understand what has happened in the past in order to make good assumptions for educated assumptions for the future, taking into account that the future will be different than the past. And in that process of gathering information and processing it and making sense of it, I think I would imagine artificial intelligence can play an interesting role, but that's where I have to stop. I don't know. I would not really know how in other parts of the energy industry this would play out. But for gathering information, processing it, making sense of it, you have to do a lot of that. When you do scenario planning, it might take 1 to 2 years for a team to actually do that. Consult experts, interview them, have meetings, have workshops, look at things from different angles. Yeah, all that can be fast and can be sped up, I think, by using artificial intelligence. Yeah. Other questions?
Okay, thank you, sir, for your answer. I have another question. Is it more preferable to conduct the scenario planning at the field level and engage with the involved community? Or we can do it with the leadership team of the company?
Well, but in community, you mean where the operations take place?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, to some extent. I mean that it might be difficult, though. I mean, basically scenario planning is done by a team in the strategy department, for example, and obviously with access to leaders in the company that that need to digest what is being presented to them, and leaders, decision makers should also take part in the scenario planning exercise. But for actually dealing with communities out in the field, I'm not so sure that it is very relevant, because it might confuse them very much. It might not sort of bring the clarity that they need to engage with a company with regard to the activities that are planned. On the other hand, the example that I gave about scenario planning exercise with NGOs and with authorities and so on was very useful to bridge gaps. So in that situation, if you say, well, the purpose is to bridge gaps between communities and companies, NGOs, authorities, it might in certain situations be something that you can consider, but only in very special situations, I think. It's not something, because it's so involved, but people can get more confused, then it can give them clarity.
Okay, it is clear. Thank you, sir. We have another question from Fatah. Fatah is asking, is analogies with the history of other companies can be considered for scenario planning?
Sorry, can
be considered for scenario planning.
Yeah, but what's the first part of your question?
Is analogies with with the history of other companies can be used as a reference for our scenario planning? Yeah.
Yes, I mean, in the sense of the global scenarios. If you I mean, I guess you're all students still, but if you would come to work for a company and you would say, well, I'm going to be involved in scenario planning, or then it's very good to take a look at what other companies have done already. And as I said, that's being published. That's being published on the internet. So you can take advantage of that and use all of that, but not just copy paste, but use that as a starting point, because the whole idea of scenario planning is the value is more in the process itself, in actually doing it, because then you learn rather than just to copy what others have done. I think it's good to look at what others have done as a starting point, but then you should do your own thinking in terms of developing scenarios of the world or of your country or of your local environment, whatever is relevant. Because in the process of actually doing that, having the discussions, debating, challenging all that, then you learn. And that's the whole objective of scenario planning. It's to learn.
Okay, thank you, sir. We have another question from Amin, which is more Algeria-related question. During your study on Algeria, were there any scenarios where Algeria starts to focus more on its petrochemical industry?
No, I don't remember that. It was the focus in that study or that exercise was more on the upstream and the situation there with the, how the whole network of upstream companies and the relationship with Sonatrach and so on featured. And for example, what potential there would be for Algeria to move towards renewable energy, rather, but not so much the petrochemical industry now.
Okay, I have another question. Assuming that the company is on crisis, how did this affect the scenario planning?
Let me see. Where is that? Assuming that
the company is on crisis, how did this affect the scenario planning?
On crisis?
Yeah. How did this affect the scenario planning? I mean that if the company is facing issues and problems, can we perform scenario planning that time? Or we should...
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, I mean, there are different, well, there are different answers to this. First of all, if you are in a crisis, then clearly you need to respond to that crisis, and you need to say, okay, what are the possible ways this crisis might evolve, and then you have maybe short-term scenarios for in relation to the crisis itself. But there can be there may be another angle to this, and that is that if you're in a crisis and that relates to issues that you have studied in your earlier scenario work, then you can benefit from that by saying that, okay, we already thought about this, and now we're in this situation. So that means that these and these mechanisms might occur. So we now know what to do. And an example of that is the oil crisis in 1973. You were all not born by then, I think, but you may remember that, or maybe not, that in those years there was some oil crisis where the oil price spiked, and where there were oil boycotts of certain countries. And at that time, well, this guy Pierre Rock, of which you saw a short video, he already in his scenarios said, well, there could be an oil crisis, and this and this could happen. And the reasons for that are these and these, and he painted the picture of why an oil crisis could occur. So when it actually happened, the Shell management was not surprised. They already had been debating the possibility of an oil crisis, and then more or less knew what to do. In that way, scenario planning, if you have thought about certain issues already, you can better act in a crisis. So that's one way to use scenario planning. And another way is obviously when you have a crisis and you want to find a way out, you may need to paint some different possible ways that the crisis will continue.
Okay, thank you, sir. I will check if there is more questions. So if anyone has a question, please, this is the time to get your answers. Meanwhile, I have another question regarding the COVID-19 pandemic. How do the global pandemic like COVID-19 affect all the scenarios already done by the companies?
Yeah, so in the in the scenarios that Shell developed in February this year, obviously the impact of COVID-19 is incorporated in those scenarios. So I don't remember exactly what it is, but you would need to look on the Shell website to find those scenarios and to see how exactly COVID is built in. Now, for the energy industry, you can clearly then think about different ways that the pandemic will impact the economic growth, and economic growth is always related, or energy demand is always related to economic growth. You will see that. So the degree to which the economy will recover from the the pandemic will feature in the scenario work. So if there's slow recovery, it will be less demand and so on. So that's one thing. Another thing is, for example, how COVID or the pandemic might influence the way of working and the globalization, and that might also have an impact on the way you run your company. So that you think about how one of the issues, obviously, with the COVID has been the supply chains and so on, and the vulnerability of global supply chains. That's something that has been discussed quite a bit. And you can think about more scenarios about how that will evolve. Will it go back to the normal situation that it was 2 years ago, or will there be a restructuring of the global supply chains? So in that way, the COVID situation will feature in the scenarios that companies will make.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Amina. Amina is asking, the Schlumberger company is taking the challenge of transferring oil and gas drilling costs and operations to geothermal to become mainstream. Is there any scenarios for this challenge?
Say that again. Is transforming?
Okay. The Schlumberger company is taking the challenge of transferring oil and gas drilling costs and operations to geothermal to become mainstream. Is there any scenarios for this?
Not that I know. I mean, geothermal is I haven't seen that a lot in scenarios that I have seen, because it's, I think it's not felt as to be, but I may be wrong, a major that it's going to be a very, it will contribute, but it is not the major contributor to the energy system, I believe. And I have not seen a lot of geothermal references in these scenarios that I have read from Equinor or from Shell or others, that it's going to be a major component in the energy system. It will certainly be there and support certain things, but it's not a game changer as far as I know. So I haven't seen it a lot, but it may be because that's a wrong perception. But maybe the person who asked the question can clarify that and maybe teach me something.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I don't think if this is clear to you, Amina. If no, you can discuss it with our guest. I have another question, sir. Do you think that nowadays the climate change is the most important aspect to take on consideration for the future scenarios?
Yes,
Okay.
I think it's very important, and it will impact. Well, in the sense of it's a lot of uncertainty, not so much about how whether or not climate change is there or whether it will affect. I think it's reasonably certain now, although some may still think about that question differently. But the way the world will respond is going to be, that is very uncertain, whether or not we will be able to deal with it at all as mankind. I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty about that. And so in that sense, I think it's a very important element, because if there's a lot of uncertainty, it's an important topic to be considered for scenario planning. And so because I think that there is, it's not clear at all if the response by the collective countries to the issue will be adequate. It will be a major feature in scenario planning.
Okay, thank you, sir, for making it clear. So no more questions here. I think that we are coming to the end of this session. So thank you again, Mr. Krijnen, for your sharing and contribution in today's session. Thank you for all those who joined us today. I hope that it was beneficial and instructive for you. And just to highlight this session has been recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. You will find the link in the chat box below. So subscribe and stay in touch with us for more upcoming opportunities. Thank you once again for all of you, and wishing you a good day. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Goodbye.